This is BBC Radio 4, and now the writer and journalist Lynsey Hanley continues her series Streets Apart, telling the history of social housing. Today she learns how a plan to build up to answer post-war housing need turned sour with the collapse of Ronan Point, one of a wave of 1960s prefabricated tower blocks. The move towards vertical living began much earlier in France and later inspired Park Hill in Sheffield with the architectural vision of Streets in the Sky.
The glass lifts obviously give you advantage of the city views.
Park Hill in Sheffield. This extraordinary building has, in a way, become a vessel for the thoughts and beliefs that people have about post-war council estates, both good and bad.
It's just an incredible building.
It's so close to town, it's very convenient, it's a kind of communal setting. You pass people on the streets in the sky.
And I work not too far away, about 5 minutes walk away.
There are some retirees and families in social housing here, but many are young professionals like Chris, a local physics teacher, or singer Lizzie, who's buying a flat with her musician husband.
There's more window than wall in the flat, and that just adds so much kind of light and airiness, and obviously the view is just breathtaking. That won me over immediately, obviously.
I brought my mum here, and she looked around and she was like, when are they going to finish the plastering? I was like, no, mum, that's why I love it. It's a bit stark, but it's not cold, and it's a bit of a reminder about kind of what the building is.
My name is Lynsey Hanley, and in this episode of Streets Apart, I'm going to explore how council housing in the 50s and 60s came to be defined by one thing: building upwards to meet housing needs and to create new homes for those displaced by slum clearances. Park Hill, constructed in the late 50s, was an early attempt at vertical living, but the thrust of the post-war era was to build higher still. Harold Macmillan's Conservative government ended that decade by giving subsidies to local authorities for every floor over the fourth storey. Radical new ideas emerged, with young architects often finding work in local authority housing departments, such as Jack Lynn and Ivor Smith.
So the aim of Park Hill was to provide, at a very high density, which meant building high, all the advantages of living on a street.
The idea was to replicate the street life of the old terraces on wide raised decks, rather like the decks of a ship, and nothing like the narrow walkways of the later tower blocks.
What we called streets in the air, places where you could bring a chair out in the evening and talk to other people. Children played on the decks.
So the names of the streets were the names taken off the old streets of the back-to-back terraces.
Raymond Kinsella helps to manage tenancies on the Park Hill scheme for the housing association Great Places.
So when people moved in, they moved in next door to neighbours they lived next to in their previous housing.
The deck itself is wide enough for the milkman to bring his cart along, or for two women with prams to stop for a talk and still let the postman by.
The architects of Park Hill understood that building community life was important, but they also wanted to give people freedom. Freedom from the squalor, dirt and depression of life in poor quality housing.
There were the most horrendous slums. There was a standpipe for water and one WC. Probably half a dozen families would share these amenities.
So you've come to Glasgow, have you? Pretty grim, isn't it? Dirt, filth, stench everywhere. And believe me, there are literally hundreds of back courts, every bit as bad as this in Glasgow.
The buildings were so close together that light hardly penetrated into the courtyard.
I call this existing. Who could live under these circumstances?
How many apartments have you, Mrs. Morrison?
I live in a room and kitchen. There's myself, my husband, my daughter, an old lady 85 years of age. We can't get living. There's no light, no fire. I did have a son, but he preferred army life to living, as you call it, under these conditions.
Whether in Sheffield or Scotland, the idea of vertical living as a solution to squalor on the ground was new to Britain. But its origins can be found in Marseille, in a building designed by a radical young architect, whose style, right down to his little round, black-rimmed spectacles, was much copied. His name? Le Corbusier.
Space and light and order. Those are the things that men need just as much as they need bread or a place to sleep.
So Le Corbusier was a Swiss-French architect. He came up with one of the most imitated bits of housing in the world in 1948, his design of the Unité d'Habitation in Marseille.
John Grindrod wrote the book Concretopia, a journey around the rebuilding of Britain.
One thing that he was very keen on, what he called streets in the air, great big wide boulevards through the centre of the building. You get shops, restaurants, you get the running track on the roof. It's like a sort of vertical garden city, he calls it.
The design of the Unité formed the foundations of a new architectural movement known as brutalism. The term originates from the French word for raw concrete, not least because Corbusier's material of choice was just that. His one concession to colour was to mix bright pastel pigment into the concrete for the building's balconies.
So you have this almost kind of like Mondrian kind of effect. And it's a huge apartment block, like an ocean liner, which was very much the kind of big inspiration for a lot of these early modernists.
Regardless of Corbusier's grand ideas, the focus of Sheffield Council and the Park Hill architects Lynn and Smith was to provide a safe, comfortable place for people to live.
In all, there were just under 1,000 dwellings. Everybody had their own little balcony.
Well, the thing I like best about the kitchen is the sink unit.
Everybody had what to the people who moved in were luxurious kitchens.
Then you've got the cooker, which is electric, which is just supplied when you come in. Then you've got all this cupboard space.
It's like being in heaven up here. These places are just lovely for us, be either for old age or young age.
Park Hill was heaven for some, but for its time it was one of a kind. Of the countless estates built in the post-war period, too few were planned and executed with such care. The twin lures of money and speed led to the spread of an arguably less successful housing trend, tower blocks.
The government passed in the mid-1950s a new Housing Subsidies Act. The higher the building, the more money the local authority got.
Sam Webb started his career as an architect in the 1960s. He says that government figures of the time, beginning with Keith Joseph, Macmillan's housing minister, were so determined to speed up the process of slum clearance and to solve housing shortages that local authorities started using prefabricated building materials so that they could build faster.
What we need is industrialised building, or as it is now described, housing from the factory.
Well, these were concrete panels cast in a factory, which you literally built a wall on top of another wall with a floor in between, like a house of cards.
All this means a big and sustained drive to get rid of the slums at a much faster rate.
It's said that Joseph counted homes rather than sheep when he couldn't sleep at night. In 1964, the government approved 27,000 high-rise flats. Tower blocks seemed to be the magic solution. Then came Ronan Point.
So Ronan Point was finished in early 1968, and a month after people move in, there is a gas explosion.
The gas explosion removed the load-bearing walls on the outside of the building, the flank walls.
Miss Hodge, whereabouts were you in the building and what happened?
I was in the kitchen filling the kettle out just to put, I was going to put it on the gas, but I never managed to do that. Next minute I was on the floor and...
Whereabouts are you in the building?
18th floor.
And it blows the wall out of her kitchen, and that in turn blows the wall out of her living room. And the living room is on the corner of Ronan Point. That sort of structure is suddenly vulnerable. The flats above start to topple down on top of hers. And that whole corner of Ronan Point, almost to the bottom, sort of shears off. And so it's this terrible disaster.
We had a terrific explosion. I see a load of rubble coming past the window, and the next thing we knew, half the building was already falling down.
What did you do then?
or we just panicked, up and ran.
There were 4 people killed, 17 people quite badly injured. Well, the public inquiry said, as Ronan Point had been built, it was certainly hazardous, but it could be made safe.
And then there's a weird coda to Ronan Point, which is, amazingly, it's rebuilt, and a lot of the original residents moved back into it. And even Ivy Hodge, who got blown up, says that she wouldn't mind moving back in. She really liked it. And then it got demolished in the end.
Although far fewer tower blocks were built after the Ronan Point inquiry, some, like Grenfell Tower, which was completed in 1974, were designed to avoid such hazards. Meanwhile, Park Hill's design was so innovative that in the late 90s, Historic England, then known as English Heritage, decided to give the estate a Grade 2 listing.
I think it's that bringing together the best of the old and the best of the new that is completely radical.
Elaine Harwood of Historic England.
And it's designed specifically for this site.
In spite of the praise showered on the building from architects and academics, there were problems with Park Hill, some associated with poverty and Sheffield's industrial decline, others with the fact that tenants still found it hard to cope with a new and unusual living environment.
But now the planner's dream has gone wrong. In this block, 4,500 people live, but hundreds of families have asked to move to low-level homes.
I don't think it's very good for your nerves because there's been quite a few suicides on here.
People don't like Park Hill, some people don't, because it's outside appearance.
Well, it's generally made my nerves bad. And what do you say to your children when they want to go out and play?
If the full Sheffield Council agrees today, the first rehousing will begin immediately. In 10 years' time, no families in the city with young children will live in flats, and the social experiment of streets in the sky will be at an end.
It was emptied out in the late noughties. Urban Splash took it over, and then the bottom went out of the economy, so its restoration and redevelopment have been much slower than was first intended.
Today, in 2017, the first phase of that restoration is now complete. And on a bright sunny morning, on the short walk up from Sheffield Station, Park Hill looks stately and desirable.
The tide has turned here in the city now, because when I first started working on this project, about 6 or 7 years ago, when we were first in the stages of show apartments.
All the apartments of this first stage are now sold or rented.
On sale. It was quite a challenge with people's views.
Soraya Falconer is involved in marketing Park Hill for Urban Splash.
People have a very sort of Marmite approach to Park Hill.
Here, affordable means those who earn less than £50,000.
Here we are, better late than never.
That's all right.
How are you?
I'm not too bad. Good morning.
So,
I used to live on the other side of the city.
And did you used to look across at this building and think, wow?
It was one of those kind of places where I said sort of to a few people that I'm moving to Park Hill. It was a sharp intake of breath. One of my colleagues said, well, Christopher, I didn't realise you were so into heroin, which I'm not. But I think it's changed a lot in terms of it used to be all social housing and now it's changed into being more of a mix. I don't think it warrants the same sort of sharp intake of breath.
In many ways, it is that sharp intake of breath which defines public attitudes to social housing. In the next programme, I'll be looking at how planners and politicians took yet another approach. Instead of going up, they decided to build out.
Streets Apart was presented by Lynsey Hanley. The producer is Sarah Parker, and it's a Juniper production for BBC Radio 4.
Hello, I'm Miles Jupp, and when I'm not giving to charity, I host a topical comedy panel show on BBC Radio 4 called The News Quiz. We'll soon be back on your radio with Series 94 of the programme. If you haven't listened to the previous 93 series, don't worry, you have a little while to smash through the 1,000 or so hours of content so you're up to scratch. We're back this Friday at 6:30pm, so get yourself ready, pop the kettle on, and keep it boiling.